Imports or exports in an African business context, which one is the better business model? Welcome back, dear Africa Business Jumpstarters. I'm Dr. Harnet, your Africa business trainer and consultant online and offline. On my channel, I teach you how to do business in Africa and how to invest on the continent the right way. Now, today I want to look into trade. Importing into Africa or exporting out of Africa, which one is the best business model and why? So for those of you who are interested in trade, this is a very important aspect. And I want to break this down into two precise aspects, why one business model is stronger than the other. But I also want to see it in the context of a changing world. So let's look at the sustainability of an importing or exporting business in the context of Africa. Is it a business model of the future? Now let's dive straight in. I have always thought that in the context of Africa, exporting out of Africa is a much more sustainable business model. And there are two main reasons for that. Number one, Africa is experiencing a major trade deficit. And that means that it is importing much more than it is exporting. Now, while that is true for a lot of countries or even most countries across the globe, the challenge for Africa is that it can only get access to hard currency, so the dollars, the euros, the pounds, and so on, if it exports products into the world. That includes intra-African trade and it includes export into the West or into Asia. So for that reason, you will find that across Africa's emerging economies, governments are clearly promoting exports, and that shows in the policies. Hence, when you are doing business in an emerging economy where we have a lot of dynamics and volatility and where policies are changing very fast and constantly, it is important to recognize that exports will experience a much more stable policy environment. So in a policy context, that means that you will find more and more enabling policies for export, because that is what governments promote. On the contrary, when it comes to imports into Africa, so the kind of trade that is creating a trade deficit on the continent by and large, then that means that those policies are more and more disabling. So governments in Africa want to disencourage you for making imports. Now, there is an exception to that rule, and that is if your imports are an important driver to some of the key industries. So, for example, if government also promotes the real estate industry or infrastructure, then many governments are making it easy for you to import, for example, construction material or steel or machinery that are very, very important for this particular industry. The same is often found with the food industry or the manufacturing industry. So those are the exceptions by and large when importing into Africa. But when you are talking about processed goods, consumer goods, fast-moving consumer goods, or cars, things that are not really a driver to one of the key industries within Africa, then most governments are discouraging from those imports, and therefore these imports are becoming more expensive in terms of the tax you have to pay, or sometimes they are banned altogether, as we have seen, for example, with the imports of second-hand clothing in Rwanda, and it's an issue widely being discussed across Eastern Africa. So another very important driver for export is that you are creating employment opportunities when you are exporting, for example, agricultural produce out of Africa, fast-moving consumer goods, or minerals. And that is very important to a lot of African governments. They want to increase employment on the ground and get more of the taxes also. And therefore, that is another enabling factor for your exports. So as you can see, these are very important drivers for governments in Africa's emerging economies. And let's remind ourselves that not every country in Africa is actually an emerging economy. So I'm talking about the dynamic emerging economies. And in those economies, African governments will enable policies because more of the money will stay in Africa when you export out of the continent. Number two, very, very important also to realize is that when you export out of Africa, you are making hard currency. So as a business owner, you are making dollars or hard currency in your business. On the contrary, because you're selling outside of Africa or in other African nations, on the contrary, when you are importing into the country that you're based in, then you will be spending your dollars and you will be selling and earning local currency. Now, in some countries in Africa, it is not a problem to exchange the local currency into US dollar. You may have a US dollar account in your African country, but we have also seen that in times where a country struggles or where the global economy struggles, that there will be a shortage of dollars or hard currency. And, the national bank in a given African country may actually decide to not make hard currency available to you at all for several months because simply there is a shortage of hard currency in the local or national economy. And that means for months you will be struggling in your business. When you're importing, you do not have access to that hard currency that you need in order to purchase more goods to import. And also, you may be just struggling generally with business operations. On the contrary, when you export, you're earning hard currency, and that means your business flow in terms of your cash flow is much easier and much more sustainable. And those are really the two big factors why exporting out of Africa is a much more sustainable business model. Now, mind you, if you are based in the West, in the USA or UK, for example, and you're importing from Africa into those countries, that again is a sustainable business model because we are now talking about, saturated markets that are fairly stable. Well, fairly stable. We know what's going on in the world today, but those countries are looking for exotic goods, for natural skincare products, for food products coming out of Africa, or for minerals. Now, as our world is changing very, very fast, I want to make you aware of some important aspects to keep in mind with a really volatile global economy and supply chain at the moment. And I think we have only seen the start of it. It will get much worse. So I'm just looking at my notes here. So there are three more aspects I want you to consider. One is that it is also possible for certain products that African nations will put a ban on exports. And that happens to products that are national staple foods. So we've seen it, for example, with the teff in Ethiopia, a national staple food where there was put a ban on the exports because enough of that needed to stay in the country, and it became very, very popular because it was a gluten-free staple. And we can see that happening right now in other countries, not just in Africa, but also the globe, So keep that in mind when we are talking about an important national staple good with global supply chain issues and increasingly food insecurity, then export bans may be put on those national goods as well. All right. So that is one aspect to keep in mind, but that doesn't really apply to most of the agricultural products, especially if they are processed for supermarkets, or if there are niche products like the superfoods or minerals. It wouldn't apply to those products really. The other aspect we need to keep in mind is the supply chain issue globally. So we will face a lot of supply chain issues when we are in import or export. And you have to keep that in mind as one of your major risks when trading. And I believe it is important to keep a focus on some products, so not to grow the range of products you're dealing with. Especially early on, you will be in complete overwhelm. If you're trading coffee and then you're trading pineapple and then you're trading superfoods, these are completely different markets. So I would say focus on one product early on, but then add a second or third product within that same category. So if you're in the category of hot beverages, you may add tea to coffee because the industry and your bias will be very similar. If you're in the category of superfoods, you may add baobab or moringa powder to your current superfoods. So you can diversify within an industry to allow for a better flow in your supply chain, because you may have supply chain issues with the primary producers in Africa to get started. So that is one aspect. Another important aspect to diversify risk during global supply chain issues are, in my view, to start selling locally, regionally, and internationally. So come up with a product that your local market would also want. It could be, tourists in your local market. It could be the upper class in your local market. And I'm saying that because you need people with purchasing power in the beginning of your business. But also keep in mind the intra-African trade. So regional trade, for example, if you're in East Africa, you start with the Eastern Africa community. If you're in Western Africa, you start with the Western region. Intra-African trade also then, of course, across the continent is growing very, very fast. And when we are seeing supply chain issues that may concern the West, the US, China, Europe, for any particular reason, then there may still be avenues to easily trade within your own African region. So intra-African trade, in my view, is a very, very important risk diversification strategy or risk reduction strategy, but it will also allow you to tap into new opportunities and new potential, because intra-African trade is just getting started. And that's really it from me today. I believe that the trading of certain products will always remain. And an important aspect actually at the very end is to trade essential products. Because I should have really added that, because when we have a globe in crisis, yes, people will still trade and pay for food, but they may not be trading your latest fashion. And that is very important to keep in mind as well as a risk reduction strategy. So as you know by now, I'm very, very passionate about getting your risk reduction strategies into place. So dear Africa Business Jumpstarters, this is it really from me. And I hope you found those insights helpful. If you're interested in importing from Africa, so supporting African exports, and if you are based outside of Africa or you are interested in intra-African trade, then you know probably that we also have an importing from Africa program. I'm going to share the link below and you can check that out. And I'll see you in the next video. Stay well and healthy wherever in the world you are.